When do people disclose abuse? Why do people choose to disclose abuse? What are the health problems of abuse?
So those strands that I've talked about, the private sessions, the public hearings of case studies, the investigations, the research and the policy, bring it together in the most comprehensive Royal Commission that's ever been undertaken in Australia. It's certainly the most expensive, it's the largest, and it could well be the longest. But that's not important. What it is it's dealing with one of the most fundamental issues that's ever confronted Australian society, and that is the abuse, the sexual abuse of children in various forms of care. So what have we heard and what have we learned so far? What we've learned is that just about all of the institutions that you know and know well will have had some forms of abuse take place within those. To date, we have had some disability services, and we have had some references to services provided for the deaf community, but not many at this stage. And hence we're conducting forums around Australia specifically to target groups that we haven't heard from in great numbers at this stage. We've heard, obviously, from abuse that took place within churches, faith-based organisations and churches themselves around Australia. And in fact, of the private sessions, so far 60% of the institutions named in the private sessions are faith-based institutions. A total of 70% are non-government institutions, 20% are government institutions, and the other 10% are unidentified. So we're starting to get a profile of what sort of institutions are most, I suppose, noteworthy in relation to child sexual abuse. The second thing is we're starting to understand about the way in which people themselves dealt with that abuse. And one of those is about disclosure. In the private sessions, which traditionally are dealing with people that were abused largely 20 or more years ago, but not exclusively so, as I've indicated, we see this pattern. We see that very few children disclosed the abuse when they were a child. And if they did, they were more likely than not to be believed, even by their parents or those close to them. For many, however, they never disclosed that abuse. Women, however, started to disclose that abuse in their late 20s and 30 years of age, and men later in their mid-40s and beyond. The average time of disclosure is about 22 years at the moment from the time of the abuse. But for many, it is much longer. For example, the gentleman who was 83. We've had many men in their 70s and 80s disclose for the first time. And so the period of disclosure is a long time. Now, most of the community doesn't understand why that occurs. And you will have even seen from time to time trials that are on television, and you will see that barristers have said to the victim, you know, why did you not wait so long? If it really happened to you, why didn't you disclose it at the time? As if the non-disclosure somehow or another was meant to be an attack on their credibility. And yet what we see is quite the reverse, that it is unusual for young people, certainly in the past, to disclose. It is much more likely they will disclose later on. Why will they disclose? There can be any number of triggers for that to occur. It can be that their own children become the age that they were at the time of the abuse. It can be that their own life circumstances have fallen apart and that many of the problems that now beset them, they in fact put back to the time of the abuse. For many, nightmares start to recur as they move into older age and grow with intensity. For many, mental and physical health problems start to emerge, some of which are directly related to the abuse that occurs. Some of it's because they see it on television, they hear it on the radio, they read it in the newspaper. For some, it's the Royal Commission itself. There could be any number of reasons why people come forward, but the reality is they come forward much later. The third thing we see is that for many people, abuse has a lifelong impact. And I don't believe for one moment that I understood it. I certainly understood that abuse, both emotional, physical, and now sexual, had impacts. But I was very unprepared to learn of the lifelong impacts that it can have for many people. For many people, they manage various parts of their life well. And in a sense, they talk about putting the abuse in a box, up on a shelf, hidden behind a door. And then suddenly, for any number of reasons, it emerges. And once that box is opened, the genie is out and it can never be put back in. But even if the genie were not put back in the box, the impacts live on. And what we now understand is that the impacts are lifelong, but it doesn't mean they can't be managed. With appropriate counselling and support, appropriate supports more generally, many people are able to manage the terrible impacts of the abuse. But for others, that's not true. For others, the journey has been a difficult one, and the journey continues to be even more difficult into the future. But what we are understanding is the supports that are necessary to be put in place to, in fact, ease that to the extent that's possible. For many people, for example, one of the issues that we hadn't even thought about but now understand is the fear of entering institutions in old age. Many people have sat before us and have said that they fear old age, not for the fact of getting older, that's something we might all fear, but actually, will they be forced back into an aged care facility? And some people look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous. They're abused in children's services. What's that got to do with aged care? Well, in many senses, nursing homes and others provides another form of institutions. And we hadn't really thought about that, and we now need to think about that. What are those impacts? For many, they are in fact lonely. Many people we see have good families. They've told their children, and the responses by the children are varied, as they always are. Children are the most unpredictable of creatures, just as we were. But for most, it's been a good revelation if told in the right way and at the right time. But for others, they're very lonely. What sort of supports do we need to put in place that, in fact, people don't go into old age, lonely and suffering from the effects of abuse that I've referred to? And these are challenges for us. And I've already indicated to you that the health problems associated with abuse are real.